Are we recording? Is this thing on?
Yes, it is. Welcome to RevOps 500, where we invite the world's top marketers to answer the tough questions facing growing organizations.
Ooh, sounds important.
I'm Sajeel Qureshi.
And I'm Gil Faye. Join us as we dive deep into the world of RevOps.
We'll be learning strategies and expertise from first-hand experience. RevOps 500 is sponsored by Computent. They provide technical and development expertise in growth-focused marketing.
Let's get started.
Hey everyone, Sajeel Qureshi here with another episode of RevOps 500, where we interview some of North America's biggest and brightest B2B marketing personalities. Today, I am extremely excited to have our guest on. He's a visionary whose company is leading the charge in shaping the future of B2B go-to-market strategies. In my opinion, in the realm of high-growth B2B companies, his company, Refine Labs, is a guiding light. They've got a lot of proprietary frameworks such as revenue R&D, and they assist different companies with demand, attributions, and analytics. Also, he's a podcast host, just like yours truly. He's the dynamic voice behind the Revenue Vitals podcast. Chris Walker, welcome to RevOps 500.
Sajeel, thanks for the kind words. RevOps is something that I'm consistently passionate about as I continue to interact with companies. And so looking forward to diving into this topic specifically.
Yeah, likewise. Glad you're here, Chris. So why don't we just jump right into it? So in your opinion, what is one RevOps myth?
I think that one RevOps myth, I actually saw it on LinkedIn today. Somebody, a COO, said that RevOps is now the most important function in go-to-market, which is something that I tend to believe as well. But when you look at it in practice, companies continue to understaff and underfund this function. They end up being mainly order takers. There's not a lot of proactive work being going on. And I think that there's just a lot more that this function needs to do for companies to drive the go-to-market strategy, not just react to reporting requests and implementing tools and things like that. So while I do believe it is the most important function, I just don't see that happening in practice as I interact with tons of large-scale companies, 1,000-person companies that have a 2-person ops team. And so those are some of the things that I think, while they have a 50 or 60-person sales team and a 50 or 60-person marketing team or more. And so, like, you just look at the investment. It's clearly not a huge priority for companies, and it needs to be.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think companies don't make it a priority, Chris? And what's your opinion behind that?
I honestly don't know. It's something that I continue to work with companies and I continue to study, but I haven't identified what the actual root cause of this is yet.
All right. So, and how would you make it a priority? If someone said to you, Chris, we want you to come in, we want Refine Labs to make and RevOps a big priority at our business, what would you say to them?
What I think that companies need to do, and some people have said this before, but I'm going to explain it in a different way. Companies say we need to break RevOps into strategic and tactical functions, which I believe is a lot. I think that most companies, when they practice quote unquote RevOps, it's all tactical operational work. How do we implement this tool, build this ad hoc report? Can I see this dashboard? Go and run these metrics. And it's all just reactive, fulfilling tickets. We need an entirely different part of this function that is using standardized science and data to make informed go-to-market strategic decisions. How are we going to think about attribution? What are the KPIs that we're going to measure? How frequently are we going to measure them? How are we going to use that data to determine how we allocate budget across marketing, sales, and SDRs, not just giving the budget between these 3 functions and letting them decide those things as they go? I think we need people that have the skills to look across the entire go-to-market based on a operating framework and data model that allow them to see these patterns and be able to inform the CMO, the CRO, the CEO about why we're doing things and what decisions we should make. And I think that is a huge missing piece to what a RevOps function needs to do. That responsibility ends up falling split between the CMO and the CRO, supported by the data requests that they get from a RevOps team. And I think that we need to have a splitting that function into strategic and tactical, I think would lead to a lot more productivity across that function.
All right. So splitting it between strategic and tactical a little bit, that's kind of one of the main things that you see on the RevOps side.
There's another thing that, like, companies call it quote unquote RevOps, but they're still siloed functions. There's still someone that's responsible for marketing ops, sales op. Like RevOps is basically a rebranding of sales ops. Most companies don't have customer success ops, or it's dramatically underfunded. And it's not really looking at the entire go-to-market holistically. It's still looking at it in siloed departments. And so I think that being able to rethink how we look at this, and a lot of this is driven by the operating models that companies use, the demand waterfall, lead, MQL, SQL, SQO, that sets you up to operate in an assembly line where marketing gets leads and MQLs, SDRs call those MQLs and try and get SQLs. Sales tries to convert those SQLs into SQOs and close won deals. And it's still an assembly line with siloed departments rather than looking at it integrated where all three of these functions could be participating in all of the core parts of the revenue process.
Okay, so yeah, that's it's an interesting thing that you brought up there with the with the funnel and coming down, MQLs, SQLs, and going into deals. Now, let's talk a bit about what you guys are known for at Refine Labs, which is like the HIRO, right? The high intent revenue opportunities and stuff like that. Now, how do you tie something like when you say you go into a business, you say, look, you have to think about marketing in this way. How is that something you could tie in together with RevOps, or is it something totally different? I mean, can they work in unison, in your opinion?
It's a fundamentally new and different operating model that companies could adopt where they don't measure leads, MQLs, SQLs, SQOs, close one. They measure account activations, account conversions, hero pipeline, which is standardized based on a performance metric, as well as close one revenue. And when you fundamentally change the KPIs, you allow the teams to do different things because the KPIs are more aligned to overall business outcomes. And so I'm interested to see if RevOps can drive some of these changes, because every single CMO that I talk to knows that the demand waterfall is totally fucked. They know it's broken. They know it's not working. There's massive sales and marketing misalignment. They're adopting ABM tools in hopes that it saves the day by changing from an MQL to an MQA, but it doesn't. It's the underlying operating framework that companies use that needs to be adjusted. And that's what we're pioneering. So hero pipeline becomes one core concept, but the overall operating model is far more robust. And how you actually get to a hero pipeline calculation is by operating and looking at the data in a much more granular view based on the buyer's perspective, not the internal departments that are doing the work. And so from the buyer's perspective, how did the buyer convert, which then convert into pipeline, which then gives us what we call pipeline sources, which is a cohort of deals that have similar sales velocity dynamics based on how the buyer enters your pipeline as a surrogate for buyer intent. And then when you look at that, you might see that there's big differences between your lead gen programs, your outbound programs, your website, and your events in terms of overall sales velocity, which then allows you to look at your overall go-to-market in an entirely different way and then optimize for proven buyer journeys that already generate high sales velocity and revenue. And I think that is just a much better view than looking at it as a singular funnel, blending a bunch of MQLs with demo requests and events and outbound all together, and then looking at a blended view where your win rates show 11%. But if you break it out granularly, some programs have win rates of 4% and other programs have win rates of 35%. And they're not actually seeing those things, which would fundamentally change the company's strategy, I believe.
Yeah, and that's a good point. If you look at it that way, where you take the funnel, you flip it on its head a little bit, and then you put in like a hero model on top of it. Now, if you could like just kind of what is like one thing that you could say to like to the audience, to our listeners, about how could they apply one part of a hero model with like a RevOps strategy? Like what's the lowest hanging fruit in your opinion, Chris?
Companies could easily adjust from their definition of qualified pipeline, which is arbitrary and blended against stage one opportunities or SQLs or whatever they decide. And instead of looking at it all blended, what they could do is they could change the definition of qualified pipeline from stage one to the hero definition, which is based on a 6-month rolling historical win rate greater than 25%, which would likely shift the stage of quote unquote qualified pipeline to hero pipeline to stage 2, stage 3, or stage 4, depending on the outputs of those pipeline sources. And when you shift that goal, what you do is you force marketing to deliver outcomes that align to sales team quota attainment and revenue attainment, because it's connected by a win rate metric, not a subjective call about whether it hits stage 1 or not. And so the definition of hero pipeline can dynamically change as win rates drop. Pipeline generation is going to be later stage, and then you're going to generate quote unquote less pipeline, which is the right approach. And so that's how we're using performance data to connect the sales and marketing and force alignment. it forces alignment between the teams because the win rate metric can change, and allows those two teams to be operating in an integrated way.
Makes sense. So Chris, let's talk technically a little bit. Like what is when someone's implementing like a RevOps strategy, or let's say even if at Refine Labs you guys are implementing a RevOps strategy, what sort of technical things would keep you up at night? Just when it comes to like setting it up, the attribution, or like the strategy. What would keep you up at night in your RevOps operation?
Let's not talk about me. Let's talk about the market. I think
Sure.
what should be keeping the market up at night
Mhm.
is that every single company reinvents the wheel when it comes to ops. And you're entirely dependent on the talent of one or two people inside of your company. And so that leads to a bunch of inconsistencies. Data is defined a different way. There's no overarching standardization. So every single person inside of a go-to-market team is looking at data in a different way and then generating their opinions of the data. And it's very different than how a company looks at their P&L. Every executive in the executive team can look at the P&L in a standardized way using GAAP accounting principles and know what's going on in the business. And we need to do that with our revenue data. We have to be able to do that, to have a shared view across the executive team to inform and align our company on what decisions we're going to make. So I think that is what should be keeping companies up at night, is that in the reinvention of the wheel, like there's no standardization and there's very slow progress in innovation. And so I think that given where my company sits, we've worked with more than 250 companies inside of their Salesforce data, seeing how they do things, implementing these different things, finding the patterns of what works, accelerating the processes, standardizing the data. And I think that over time, companies will try and operate under a shared, common, standardized data model, just like they do for their P&L when it comes to their revenue data and their CRM setup and things like that. Sure, it'll allow for customization based on your segments or your geos or all those different things. But the core underlying KPI and data model, I believe, will be standardized over time so that companies can have a shared view across the executive team and go-to-market teams about what data they're looking at and why.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned something in there. So like, obviously, yeah, you're saying that there's like, it's a big cause of concern for most companies because they only have maybe one or two people focusing on RevOps, the attribution of data. And, like you talk about generally accepted accounting principles. I mean, there's a lot more insight and review of those things. So now at Refine Labs, you guys do this for companies all the time, and how do you get into those weeds and see those symptoms and diagnose them, because you said all companies come in different shapes and size. Ops is done differently everywhere. And then there's politics, there's internal, probably internal, squabbling or misunderstandings or conflict. How do you navigate all that stuff? I mean, that seems like a lot.
Yeah, for the most part, I find that at least like growth stage or relatively mature companies do not have a data collection problem. They collect plenty of data and they push it into different places. What they actually have is a data structure and processing problem. The data is not in the right structure and they don't look at it in the right way to glean these types of insights and decisions. And so what we do when we work with companies is we take their existing data, because most of it is there. We're able to manually transform it into our standardized data model using Hero Pipeline and other types of core KPIs, so that when we look at their data, it's standardized just like we've looked at the other 25 or 30 companies before that, and then are able to match patterns and trends and compare them against other of their peers. And so that transforming their data becomes the first part. While we do that, we also identify all the gaps in what their best practices should be. So what data are you missing? What data do you need? And how does it need to be structured? Then we make those recommendations, or we work with partners, or we implement it ourselves to actually put the data in the right place so that in the future, these types of analyses are far more robust. You can do them in real time instead of it taking 4 to 6 weeks to do it manually. And so those really become the advantages when you implement this, is that you go from being like running an analysis over 4 weeks to running analyses in real time, which I think is what companies are eventually what they desire right now. And they do look at things in real time. My perspective, though, is that they're just not looking at the right things in the right ways.
If they're not looking at things in the right ways, and it's not really, you don't see it as a conflict of trying to get them to find new data. It's more just making them looking at a picture in a different angle. Is that right? Or
I don't know. I'd like to say that it's a lot more robust than that, especially
obviously,
especially out of respect for all the people. Like they're doing great work. They're looking at things based on the current best practices,
Right.
but the current best practices haven't been updated in 6 or 7 years. And so I don't believe that it's hard to say that those are current best practices based on what the world was like in 2017 versus what the world is like now. So much has changed. And so it's not just about looking at the data in a different view. It's shifting your organizational thinking around an entirely new way of going to market and a new way of collecting and looking at the data around a holistic go-to-market strategy in comparison to the outdated operating models that continue to use an assembly line, which then allows marketing to optimize for MQLs or stage one pipeline. And there's a lot of things that you can do to create MQLs in stage one pipeline that don't actually convert to quote unquote hero pipeline or revenue. And by shifting the goals and aligning the teams, I think that you get generally better outcomes.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of RevOps 500. This podcast is a great opportunity and channel for revenue operations and much more. If you've been thinking about a podcast or you want to shift production to a friendly team, check out ringmaster.com. They're the team behind this podcast. RevOps 500 is sponsored by Computan. Computan serves as the back-end dev and technology team for shorthanded marketing agencies and departments. Shorthanded? Wait a minute, that sounds like me. Now, let's get back to it. The end.
So you talked a little bit about the past, Chris, and how the 6-7 years ago things changed. Things have changed a lot in the last 6 or 7 years. Where do you see the future of RevOps or even revenue attribution going? The stuff that you guys are known for.
So what I've recognized is that the B2B market moves a lot slower than we think. Not that much has fundamentally changed over the past 12 years. We still use MQLs and leads like we did in 2012. Sure, now we have contact databases and ABM platforms and intent data and all these other tools that help us run our get MQLs and leads and MQAs more efficiently. But the general model hasn't changed that much. Vendors just build technology to do what companies think that they want more effectively versus thinking about breakthrough or fundamental changes in the overall system. I think that another key thing is that what I believe that key performance indicators, KPIs versus attribution are two entirely different things. KPIs are the core metrics that we measure to understand whether we're on or off track. Attribution is a process of looking at how we allocate investments to try and decide what are the right things to cut, scale, decrease, et cetera, to drive higher ROI and growth. These are two very different things. Companies end up blending them together. They use very generous models like an influenced revenue model against all opportunities and all contacts on an account, which then shows that every single thing that they're doing has dramatic ROI and is working. Yet all the core KPIs in the business are declining for the past 6 quarters. We do this analysis enough. Hero pipeline creation down for the past 6 quarters. Sales velocity down over the past 6 quarters consistently. Marketing ROI down over the past 6 quarters consistently. And then companies share their influence revenue reports with me that show that all their programs have dramatic ROI. And it's like attribution can't show that. What you need is the core KPIs first. If the core KPIs are going in the wrong direction, there's no way that your marketing is performing better now than it was 6 quarters ago. And so I think there'll be a dramatic shift more to fundamental go-to-market KPIs as the core thing that we're looking at, then supported by attribution, not the other way around. We've created that standardized system. We report on tons of different metrics, and we look at it in a much more granular view downstream. But close one revenue quarter over quarter, hero pipeline quarter over quarter, sales velocity, which is win rate, sales cycle length, ACV, and qualified opportunities generated, marketing ROI blended against hero pipeline creation and close one revenue. And you look at those metrics, and then you see what's really going on from a business standpoint. And then you can break that down again and then look at how do our events perform versus our website versus this in terms of demand capture and demand conversion. And I think that will be the fundamental shift that companies make over the next 2 to 3 years, to have a much granular view across their entire go-to-market rather than just looking at the marketing team producing their influence revenue report to justify their $10 million program budget.
Got it. And what about like in the context of customer acquisition? Because RevOps is, of course, sales, marketing, customer success, that kind of stuff. What about in terms of customer success? How do you, what kind of metrics, what kind of change do you see happening there in the next couple of years?
To be honest, this is not a place where I spend a lot of time, and I really like to talk about the things that I know well and that I do every day. And so,
Mm.
what I'm focused on is how do companies generate net new business. And the reason I'm focused on it is because companies continue to really, especially over the past 6 quarters, continue to really struggle against net new business, which is a core growth lever inside of a company. And there's a lot of like some marketing teams I see shifting their core metric from net new closed won revenue to NRR as a marketing team. And what you should do is you should take your customer marketing budget and scrutinize that against NRR, not against your whole marketing budget. And it allows marketing teams to spend a lot of money and draft off of existing expansion revenue while they're not really helping the business or drive ROI. I really think that sales and marketing as a go-to-market budget, typically it's decided based on a percentage of revenue. And I really think it should be decided based on a percentage of net new business. Because as revenue grows, it allows the machine to continue to get more and more and more inefficient. So those are some of the perspectives that we'll continue to look at data and make more educated decisions on.
Yeah. So splitting up that customer marketing budget from net new business is something that you feel like something most business should be doing. Is that right?
It seems logical to me. Like,
Yeah.
if the core metric is NRR, and then you spend your entire marketing budget to expand customers, and you have 110% NRR, what is the overall like growth in revenue? Maybe $3-5 million for a company, right? You're a $50 million company, you get 110% NRR, it's $5 million. But you spent 10, 15, $20 million on marketing to expand customers that may have already expanded anyway, regardless of what you did in the marketing. And so I think that the way that we look at the budget based on marketing, sales, and SDRs as departments rather than an all-bound integrated revenue team, I think really changes the way that companies make decisions. If you looked at it as demand creation, demand capture, demand conversion, and account expansion, and you broke the budgets up in that way rather than by the department, you'd probably allocate budget really differently, and you'd see the holes in where you're underinvesting. And so I think that companies over time, I don't think that companies will move on that very fast, despite how obvious and I think logical it is.
It is,
An entire mindset shift thinking. I think there needs to be a lot more infrastructure for companies to feel confident in that, but smart ones will. Smart ones will at least run the analysis ad hoc and look and see that they only spend 2% of their go-to-market budget on demand creation. And they only spend, so you could look at that and then be able to identify, wow, we're way, way, way over invested in sales and SDRs relative to the entire go-to-market. Even our marketing budget skews to demand conversion and demand capture. And so I think that companies will run that analysis and hopefully it will illuminate how the budget is being divided and identify the holes.
Chris, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. How does, and I've always wondered this about you, man, like how does a computer scientist with a background in biomedical engineering get into marketing and agency work and CRO and come up with something like hero, like a metric like that? What's the story behind all that?
Because generating revenue is a science. It can be studied just like biology or pharmacology or how to make people survive more when they have cancer. It can be studied, but what we need to use scientific principles. We need standardized data. We need a new operating model based on how companies buy today. We need third-party objective peer-reviewed people to be able to look at these things and decide. When you have standardized data, then it's not just you look at one company, but you can look at 100 companies in a standardized way. And then when you look at that, you say, wow, all 100 companies ran content syndication. And out of those, they won an average lead to customer rate of 0.1%, which is 1 in 1,000. And based on this data, we can confidently say, based on statistics, that if you do this thing in this way, you are likely to get this result at a 95, 99% confidence interval, which is science, which is how they deploy strategies on patients in medicine, how they decide on how to get drugs through clinical trials. And so that's the engineering background, taking it to go to market, which has been entirely based on experience and opinion up to this point. What did you do at your last company and did it work? What did our investors say about what worked for the other companies they invested in? What's this influencer talking about how they now do this tactic? It's all people's experience and opinion, not based on large-scale scientific principles and data. And so I think that the way that we push it forward, and the reason why now for this is because the evolution of RevOps over the past 5 years has created the data infrastructure and the technology infrastructure to actually do it. 5 years ago, this wasn't possible. When the analyst firms like Gartner and Forrester and Topo and Serious Decisions were created, none of this was possible. So what they do, they talked to people and they ran surveys for people, and then they came up with theories and things like that. Now we can use data. And so I think that's a huge cause. Additionally, as we look at the distribution of content inside of LinkedIn, any single person can boot up their LinkedIn, pretend to be an influencer, and talk about all their opinions. If you scroll through LinkedIn, you'll find there's no data behind anything people are saying. It's all people's opinions, and now that everyone can do it, every single person has to sift through that stuff and try and decide, is this credible? Is this relevant for me? And then you think about your entire go-to-market team, your entire sales team, SDRs, leadership, everyone's going through that exact same process every day, consuming content and probably not thinking about how relevant is this to me? Is there data behind this? When they call this metric out like qualified pipeline, what do they mean? Is it the same as my company or not? And in science, when you say, the ball went 300 feet, everyone could measure 300 feet and know how far it was. Nobody can do that with pipeline or leads or anything like that, because everyone uses a different subjective definition. And so I think that all of my experience up to this point, manufacturing, process optimization, Six Sigma and Lean, engineering principles, statistics, science, looking at clinical trial data for the medical device companies that I worked at, all those different experiences have created a mindset where I believe that me and my company are able to really push this forward with an entirely new vision.
And if you go back to yourself when you were in school studying biomedical or computer science, what advice would you give yourself if you had a time machine going back? What kind of things would you tell yourself?
I don't really think like that. I'm a big believer in the writing of what's his name, Robert Greene. Writes about this
48 Laws of Power.
Yeah, and Mastery is actually my favorite book from him.
Oh, nice.
Talks about the stages of mastery, which I'm not a master yet, openly admit, but it talks about it. And the first 7 years are apprenticeship, or actually before apprenticeship, it's actually finding what it actually is. And so in order to do that, you need to do a lot of things. You need to try stuff. You need to move around. Most people have a very linear career where they're a marketing coordinator, and then they become a senior marketing coordinator, and then a marketing manager, and then they manage paid search, and they continue with a linear career, typically or often in the same industry. And so they don't have the different experiences in medical device and engineering and manufacturing and all these other places. And those different experiences allow you to see how different companies operate, how do different buyers operate, how do we think about these different systems that could be applied in a different way. And so when I look back at my career in hindsight, most people would say, like, this career doesn't make any sense. What was this guy doing for the past 7 years? And it's me that all of it led to this place. And so it would be like, don't follow societal norms. Don't think about needing to have a linear career path. Think about making changes based on what you're interested in or what you learn. Find opportunities outside of work to pursue other types of creative or scientific or passions of yours that allow you to get more experience, meet other people, see different things. I really think at the beginning of your career, it's really about having a diverse set of background and experiences.
Yeah. And I mean, would you feel comfortable saying that most marketers are maybe not as quantitative, in terms of like how they understand statistics and how they understand like how numbers work in marketing?
I think it's like pretty rare for a B2B marketer to come out a background of engineering or statistics or science. Right. And so I think it would be like undeniable to say that my background is different than most B2B marketers. And people have their own strength. There's a big art part of marketing in terms of copywriting and things like that some people are really strong in. And you need that stuff too. But in a company, you also need science and data. And a lot of companies, like every company looks at data, right? It's not like companies are just like guessing and making decisions. They're looking at the data. But the difference is how you actually look at it and how you analyze it. Additionally, I found over time that having someone that's outside of the company that is free of the politics and tribal knowledges and overall biases that come with it, that gives you an outside perspective about your performance based on standardized data, can be incredibly valuable, even as just a different view. of like, hey, we report this way, we're seeing this on the other side. These two things are dramatically different. What might we need to change in how we look at our data so that we can make better decisions?
Yeah, I mean that certainly makes a lot of sense. I mean, you definitely see that a lot of days. I mean, where like you said, there is an art to the marketing, but there also is the data behind it, and it is statistics. I mean, would you say that in your line of work, particularly at Refine Labs, that you guys are more focused on the data, maybe storytelling, or
We do both. We do art and science here. But the art is informed by the science, and the quality of the art is decided by the science and data. And so, like, you build a big campaign for LinkedIn, and everybody in the company thinks it's so great and it's so clever and it's so cool, and it generates no revenue. Was the art good or was it not? It wasn't good. The art should be the quality of the content, art, some copywriting, things like that should be determined based on results, not on people's opinions of how good it is. And creative and content have generally been subjective up to this point. And so I think that we need to balance both of those things, but the data ends up being the check and balance of how good our art is.
yeah, and I feel like that makes a lot of sense. So Chris, why don't you tell the audience a bit more about Refine Labs and the things that you do over there?
At my company, we study the science of manufacturing revenue. We work with a ton of companies. We are inside their CRM data. We have created new operating models and KPIs that companies can use. We've built a proprietary data model that allows us to look at a bunch of different companies in a standardized way, and we'll eventually be able to create large-scale benchmarks based on real CRM data that has never been done before. And I believe that will be very powerful in terms of looking at core KPIs for a company and then being able to also compare it anonymous and aggregated to what their peers perform at as a key level set before they even think about attribution. Some companies that I interact with perform super well relative to their peers, and internally they're complaining and think that they suck and they're missing their goals. And they're like a top 10% performer out of all SaaS companies. And you got other companies that are, 90th percentile performer way at the bottom. And internally, they think they're doing great. Their marketing ROI is 20 cents on the dollar, and they think that they're doing great. And the way to show them that is to create standardized benchmarks that are a eye opener to, hey, like, this is not a good thing. And so I think being able to create that type of data will allow and create confidence in how companies actually make decisions. And then we have implementation teams that join companies and help them implement, prove out, adopt, and train their team on how to execute a new strategy that we've created that is different than the demand waterfall, which is a full sale go-to-market team change that starts with marketing, because fixing marketing first is the way to fix this. And creating an underlying data layer that companies can use to make decisions. And then over time, we run what we call a revenue diagnostics process quarterly. We calculate all these different metrics. We guide their roadmap and how they invest budget from the outside. Internal teams aren't doing this in RevOps. We think it's a huge opportunity that companies need to split strategic and tactical work. Okay, internally, you do the tactical work based on our guidance, and we're going to handle the strategic work right now until companies properly resource and fund that function to be able to do it. I think that we serve a really critical part of the go-to-market strategy for B2B companies today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Chris. And where can people learn more about you? Where can they connect with you?
Yeah, feel free to check out the podcast. It's the B2B Revenue Vitals podcast, available on Apple and Spotify. It has been on fire recently. Appreciate all the listeners, the kind words. Thank you for that. You can also follow me on LinkedIn, Chris Walker 171. I post content there almost every day. A lot of clips from the podcast that are more micro, bite-sized things. So feel free to check me out there as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can just speak for all of us here, Chris. Thanks for coming on and being part of the show. It's been a lot of fun learning about you, jamming about you with the numbers, learning a bit about your background. It's been a great experience.
Yeah, this was a blast. Great interview. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so for anybody listening out there, if you learned something today, let us know. Give us a shout. Check out Chris online. Check out the podcast. He's really good. He's a good follow. Thanks again, Chris, for coming on.
Thank you.
This has been another exciting episode of RevOps 500, and we'll see you guys next time. And that wraps up another episode of RevOps 500. Thanks for joining. For show notes and other episodes, visit us at RevOps500.com. RevOps 500 is sponsored by Computech, providing technical and development expertise to growth-focused marketing teams.